all set to rule Afghanistan celebrated with a victory parade in Kandahar. This was no normal military parade. On display were the Taliban's military loot, from American armored fighting vehicles to Black Hawk choppers and M4 rifles. Everything was showcased under the Taliban flag, giving a clear message that the group now controls the ground and the skies.
Taliban's victory parade in Kandahar, South Afghanistan. Kandahar has been Taliban's earlier headquarters, and this is where the Taliban are parading American weapons and platforms, now in their control. These are American armored fighting vehicles used by US and Afghan troops in Afghanistan. But now, these vehicles move under the Taliban flag with hundreds of Taliban fighters dressed in US pattern camouflage fatigues, waving American M4 rifles. And as dozens of armored fighting vehicles and Humvees roar down the Kandahar highway, a US Black Hawk helicopter flies overhead, once again displaying the Taliban flag. The signals are very clear. Taliban controls the ground and the skies above in Afghanistan. Taliban spokesperson Mullah Zabiullah Mujahid has said so in as many words, celebrating their victory over the United States after 20 years of being on the run.
There was no need for war. Unfortunately, the US officials used arrogance at the time. They did not consider the outcome of their work, and the result was that now they were defeated.
The weapons on display include, apart from the Humvees and the armored fighting vehicles and the Black Hawk helicopter, an assortment of small arms, including M4A1 rifles, its magazines, pistols and other sidearms and body armor. The Taliban are already dressed in US pattern camouflage fatigues. The US has, however, claimed they demilitarized all aircraft, helicopters and armored vehicles in Kabul. The US are learned to have taken out key components and damaged some crucial equipment to ensure that neither the aircraft nor the helicopters remain airworthy. But the victory parade showcasing US weapons, Taliban are clearly having the last laugh. Bureau Report, India Today.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is taking shape, while official coronation in Kabul has been deferred by a day to Saturday. We now know the men who will rule Afghanistan. Abdul Ghani Baradar, the co-founder of the Taliban, is all set to be president of the new government, while Hebatullah Akhundzada will be the supreme leader. There's a tussle over who gets to be the prime minister. Would it be Mullah Omar's son, or would it be the Ghani network? A skeptical world is watching for clues on whether the new regime will be able to keep its promises to Afghanistan, especially to its women.
The stage is set in Kabul for Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar to head the next Taliban dispensation in Afghanistan. Mullah Hebatullah Akhundzada, the supreme commander of Taliban, will continue to lead as the spiritual leader of the organization based in Kandahar. Sources tell India Today, Taliban's political office head, Mullah Baradar, is likely to lead the Taliban government in Kabul. Baradar, the co-founder of the movement, is expected to have political power over the governing council but operate under Hebatullah Akhundzada. Other names that are doing the rounds to key positions include Sirajuddin Haqqani, the deputy leader of the Taliban, and Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, son of Taliban's founder Mullah Muhammad Omar, who died in 2013. Sher Mohammad Abbas Tanikzai is likely to be the new foreign minister of Afghanistan. And Sadar Ibrahim, an expert in roadside bombing, could be the new interior minister. As Taliban readies the presidential palace in Kabul for the ceremony, women in Afghanistan have taken to the streets demanding a right to work and to education. A similar demonstration was reported in Herat on Thursday as well. The Taliban are set to announce the cabinet, with a skeptical world watching on whether.
Joining me on this broadcast is Mohammad Ashraf Haidari, Ambassador of Afghanistan to Sri Lanka, joining us from Colombo. With us also on this broadcast is Faiz Zalan, Professor at Kabul University, political commentator. We have with us Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., specializes in the area around Afghanistan and the broader Middle East. Sushant Sareen joins us, Strategic Affairs expert, Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Rakesh Sood has been our ambassador to Afghanistan, and it's to him that my first question will go about this fissure that seems to be emerging over who will get to be the Prime Minister. Lots of reports in Afghan media, in international media, that there is a tussle over the Raisul Wazara, or who gets to be the figurative Prime Minister. Would it be Sirajuddin Haqqani or Mullah Yaqub, who's Mullah Omar's son? Is this a deep fissure? Is it for real? Is it just a very superficial gap that they'll be able to find a solution to? Or do you think that we're seeing some fissures now emerge in Kabul? Welcome, Ambassador Sood.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. I think it was on your show about a week ago that I had pointed out that unlike the Taliban in the 1990s, which was a militarily untested, politically unknown, but at least a unified entity under Mullah Omar, this Taliban is somewhat different. It is a known commodity. It is militarily tested in the sense that it has come to power not through negotiations, but by following the military track. And at the same time, it is no longer as unified. I think I had pointed this out, and this is precisely what we are seeing. Now, what is interesting in this is the fact that even though Taliban, Kabul fell on 15th of August, it is only around the 30th or 31st that Al-Qaeda actually issued the formal congratulatory message. And it is only now that we are hearing that Osama bin Laden's head of security, Dr. Amin al-Haq, who had been with him at Tora Bora in 2001, is now making a grand entry with a convoy of fighters at Nangarhar. So clearly, the Al-Qaeda influence is being reasserted. Now, the Al-Qaeda statement is very interesting because it mentions, of course, Osama bin Laden, and it recalls that Osama bin Laden pledged his allegiance to Mullah Omar, and then mentions that Ayman al-Zawahiri has pledged his allegiance first to Akhtar Mansour, who was killed, and then to Mullah Hebatullah. And there is only one other name that is being mentioned in terms of his martyrdom being respected, and that is Jalaluddin Haqqani. There is perhaps a message in that. I don't know. So we will have to wait and see. But clearly, now that Al-Qaeda is back in a sense of showing itself, because so far, for 2 weeks, it had maintained a low-key presence, unlike the TTP. The TTP chief, Masood, Nur Wali Masood, had issued a congratulatory message at least 10 days earlier. Hamas and various other groups have congratulated the Taliban on their enormous victory. But Al-Qaeda had been somewhat quiet. So I think this is perhaps an indication of the way things are going to go now, that the victory is definite. It has been ascertained that the time has come for a distribution of the spoils of power. And Al-Qaeda will ensure that its share of the spoils of power is theirs.
Mohammad Ashraf Hydari, is that your reading as well? That the Haqqani faction, which is known to be more brutal, more barbaric than the more political, external leading Doha faction, and that there are some fissures that we're already beginning to see emerge from Kabul. Is that likely to get worse? Is this just too much being interpreted from the outside? Given your understanding of your country, sir, how are you processing what's happening back in Kabul and Kandahar?
Well, I cannot really comment more than what the ambassador just discussed, and I'm sure others will contribute to that discussion. But what's really going on is a sort of puskashi, and many factions tied to different regional and transnational terrorist networks and militant networks, and as well as their related state actor friends and sponsors are involved. So that's one issue. But what we in the Afghan people are concerned is about the actual formation of a meaningful, inclusive, and representative government that includes all voices, including the women of Afghanistan, which is now more than 50% of our population. And as well as my concern is also about the humanitarian situation that is further deteriorated over the past week, simply because the international community, although they've been talking about it, they've not been forthcoming, with exception of a few plane loads of humanitarian assistance, 1 or 2 tracks of humanitarian aid from Central Asia, especially from Turkmenistan. Not much has happened as people are suffering in Kabul. Remember that over 500,000 Afghans were internally displaced, on top of 5 million others, protracted IDPs, and then 18 plus million Afghans needing urgent humanitarian assistance. As this political, issues are taking shape, which the ambassador pointed out.
No, so you're making a very important point, Sushant Sareen. The Afghan ambassador Hydari talking about how humanitarian issues should really be first in the list of priorities. But for that, you need a well-established, well-settled political setup where leaders are working closely with each other. How real do you think are the differences between Sirajuddin Haqqani and the Haqqani network and Mullah Muhammad Yaqub? This fight for the spoils of war, in your understanding of the current state of play, how real is it? How bad is it?
So, Rahul, I think these divisions have persisted for a fair bit of time. And in fact, the first time we really saw these divisions emerge was after the death of Mullah Omar had been announced, and there was a bit of a battle over the succession before the Pakistanis finally installed Mullah Mansoor as the Amirul Mu'mineen. And at that point of time, Yaqub was a bit of a holdout. There were others from the south, Helmand in particular, who opposed it. Then they papered over those cracks. Now, clearly those cracks have persisted, and not too long back, they decided to bifurcate the responsibilities, but the military responsibilities between the Haqqani faction and Mullah Yaqub. So that is one line of division. But then there are others between the political guys who were sitting in Doha and were the interface to the rest of the world, saying all sorts of what Dr. Christine Fair says about the Pakistanis. Apparently, these Taliban have also learnt it, what she calls pleasant lies, telling pleasant lies to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world getting taken in by it. So there were those guys, and then there were the guys who were fighting on the ground. These were the fellows who had the closest links with other terrorist organizations like TTP, Al-Qaeda, and that entire bunch of people, who have been fighting, according to some estimates, as much as 20,000, some estimates even more. So there are those very clear divisions between the political side and the military side, where the militant guys are saying that, look, we were the guys who won this war at the end of the day. So what is our share of spoils? And then, of course, there are those traditional ethnic and tribal rivalries as well. Now, most of these had been papered over when you were fighting a common enemy. Now you are not. So now there will be these divisions. What we need to observe is whether these divisions are the kind of divisions which you would normally see in any movement or a political party, that once you get power, there is this tussle for office, this tussle for, some of the interesting positions or the nice positions. So there is that factor. Or is this going to escalate into something more? Frankly speaking, I'm not in a position to say. But I think one thing is very clear. If they start acting against the Al-Qaeda, and Ambassador Sood has very correctly pointed out the very deep linkages of the Al-Qaeda with the larger Taliban movement, but the Haqqanis in particular. So if they start targeting these guys, then I think you might see all these divisions and these factional fights boil over. I think that's what you need to look out for. But if they don't take action against those guys,
on the one side, you've got the Taliban, which has made an international commitment that their soil will not be used for terrorist activities. On the other, you've got the likes of Aminul Haq coming back to Kandahar to a rapturous welcome, chief of staff of, Osama bin Laden. And then the world wonders whether there will be action taken by the Taliban against Al-Qaeda leaders, or do you think that they'll be happy to host them like they did in the late 90s?
Thank you for having me. I think Taliban are also, like any other human beings, going through transformation first. Second, the comparison that we are putting to 1990s and then to 2021, I think we should be careful that we are discussing decades, not years, not months. In decades, country changes. The development that now we have in Delhi, 20 years ago, the Delhi was not the same as it is. The BJP leadership that we have in 2021 today, it was not the same leadership as it was in 90s. So structures, institutions, and people, they change. Taliban are also going through that big change. International community, US, they have recognized them through a peace agreement implemented completely. They did withdraw all their troops on the ground. They have been still in consultation with Taliban for recognition and legitimacy. Humanitarian aid and many other things are already on the ground. The people that we name them as Al-Qaeda or their affiliates, I think they were considered affiliates and Al-Qaeda members in 1990s, but in past 20 years, for example, Khair Khwa, Nabi Umari, for example, Mullah Fazil, many of others of them, they were kept in Guantanamo for more than 10 years without being any trial, without being giving them any formal prosecution. So they have been released now. They have been back to Kabul, to the power center of Afghanistan, the political power center of the Afghanistan. They are very curious. They are very cautious about making their new setup, new political setup, because they are considering all these issues that we discussed: the legitimacy, recognition, human rights, women's rights.
No, but you're giving us a broad sweep. You're not telling us your insights into whether you believe the Taliban will allow a free run to the Al-Qaeda. Sushant Sareen raises a very important point.
No,
will they act against the Al-Qaeda, or will they just let them be and let them flourish?
No, sure they will do, because they have international commitment. Otherwise, the international community, EU, US, they will get back to Afghanistan with their forces. They will be back in Afghanistan fighting. They have a commitment, a formal commitment with US and NATO, a written commitment that we need to fight against any terrorist groups, not naming only Al-Qaeda, but any terrorist groups around the world. If they are sheltered in Afghanistan, if they are nearby Afghanistan, to fight against them together.
Michael Rubin, do you buy that at all? Because the manner in which Aminul Haq came back to a rapturous, thunderous response in Kandahar, the fact that you've got all these Al-Qaeda operatives now out of jail, back on the streets of Afghanistan, is that reason to fear what may happen in the weeks, days and months to come? For the moment, Faiz Zalan making it seem as if their written commitments made to the international world, what was signed in Doha, didn't really matter to the Taliban when they came marching into Kabul. So why should they care now that the Americans are gone and the country is theirs to run?
I disagree with Faisal. Look, if written commitments were sacrosanct, then Frank Kellogg, the Secretary of State in the 1920s, had formally outlawed war. And Neville Chamberlain came back from Germany with a paper in his hand that would prevent World War II. The fact of the matter is, while in the West, we often look at diplomacy as a means to solve problems, groups like the Taliban often look at diplomacy as an asymmetric warfare strategy in order to fool those who would put their good faith in just the written word rather than facts on the ground. We've seen that the Taliban, despite their promises on the February 29th, 2020 agreement, never disassociated themselves from groups like Al-Qaeda. In fact, 2 leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent were killed under Taliban protection after the agreement was signed. Unfortunately, I don't think that any position matters except for the supreme leader right now, Akhundzada. And if we want to focus on factions, the only factional divisions which matter is who is going to show loyalty to Pakistan, and whoever doesn't show loyalty to the ISI within the broader Taliban structure is going to find themselves killed rather quickly by the same ISI.
How badly have things gone for Biden in the United States? The world over, the American president, in many ways, the evacuation has become the laughing stock. He is being pilloried by the Republicans, but how badly has public perception in the United States been hit as a result of this disastrous evacuation from Afghanistan?
Extremely badly. Look, the Republicans are going to support Republican candidates. The Democrats are going to generally support Democratic candidates. What matters is his support among independents, and his support among independents has tanked. Now, what the Biden administration is counting on is the fact that traditionally Americans focus on their pocketbook instead of foreign affairs. But I'm afraid the humiliation here, as well as the lack of leadership, the unwillingness to answer questions, the general confusion that has been projected at the top, is going to ultimately hurt Joe Biden in the 2022 elections. And we're already starting to see that in a succession of polls which have since come out.
You know, I was talking to one of the senior most minds in the Indian national security establishment this afternoon, Michael Rubin, and the sense in India seems to be that this disastrous evacuation from Afghanistan has set America back 10 years, that it's narrowed the gap between China and the United States, and it's really shown America in very poor light, making other countries wonder whether they can rely on American support if it came to that, especially in the context of Chinese aggression. Do you believe that this could be the beginning of the end, or not just the beginning, but this could be one more step towards the end of America's reign as the world's single superpower?
Well, I disagree with your Indian source only because I think 10 years is too generous. The fact of the matter is this is a disaster. I wouldn't be surprised to see China make a move on Taiwan now. They're already projecting that the United States is weak and doesn't support its allies. I think NATO is a dead man walking. That said, I think we should be very cautious to think that China is going to become dominant in the world, because decades of one-child policy has put China on the path to a demographic precipice. We have a lot of problems in the United States, and what Biden did was a disaster, but we shouldn't whitewash what the communist Chinese are going to be facing in the years to come.
Rakesh Sood, will the disastrous evacuation of the US military from Afghanistan, in your view, embolden China? They've been thinking about toying with, strategizing, wargaming the possibility of taking over Taiwan, or at least making a massive military show of strength, much more than what they've done so far. Now that they know that America is bleeding and bruised, would that then, in your estimate, really embolden China to go for the jugular?
Well, there is one thing is quite clear, that the completely messy manner in which the US tried to implement its exit is something that has added to the Chinese and the Russian narrative in terms of saying, see, the US has left, it's not interested, it is withdrawing, it is, apart from anything else, it is quitting, it is unreliable. More so, it is even incompetent. So all of this is the narrative that the Chinese and the Russians are putting across. However, that is only to be expected. A little more concern arises from the fact that you have seen some very negative statements coming out of the US allies in Europe, who say that, oh, we were left in the lurch, we were kept in the dark, we didn't know. I mean, you've seen some of the statements that have been made by the British Defense Secretary. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister, calls Biden's decision and its implementation imbecilic. On one hand, UK has a special relationship. We've not heard this kind of language between Britain and the United States ever before. So I think there is a lot of repair, because the whole point of Biden's message of America is back was that, look, I'm here to repair my alliances. And, his visit to the NATO summit, his visit to G7, his receiving the Chinese and receiving the South Korean president and the Japanese prime minister very early on, all of these were messages to that extent. Now, it is that message that is getting somewhat, the shine of that has been taken off. And I think Biden will have to work very hard to restore the shine on that. And I don't know how it is going to be possible. And obviously, the Chinese will want to exploit every opportunity they get, whether they think that they can exploit it now or whether they will want to wait for 2 years, or a year, I don't know.
Sushant Sarin, your best guess at this moment? Rakesh Sood making an important point. China would certainly be emboldened. They will want to exploit American weakness now that it's been exposed globally. Are they likely to get more aggressive on Taiwan than they have been so far? And what form will their aggression take in your view?
Well, from my point of view, what worries me most is the American policy in the region. Having withdrawn from here, when I hear noises from Washington, D.C. that we need to do intelligence sharing with Taliban, who are in bed with the Al-Qaeda. We need to continue to work and engage in a much more progressive manner with the Pakistanis. Then I am led to believe, is America even a reliable partner, or is it even sensible for India to look at America as a reliable partner? And I look at this in the context of China, because yes, America would want us to work with them in the Quad framework, in the Indo-Pacific and all of that, which is all very well. But my challenge is, my security threats are not just out there. My security threats are also in the north with my border with China, and in the west, where a Chinese puppet, which is Pakistan, has another puppet, which is Afghanistan, and which is going to create major security nightmares for me. And if I see my so-called strategic partner now give money and intelligence sharing and what have you with Al-Qaeda and Taliban, who are in bed with the ISI, who are now going to sponsor terrorism into India, how do you expect me to deal with the Americans? Now, with these kind of contradictions coming to the fore, I'm sure the Chinese, having cemented their alliances and going forward with many of their other alliances, will steadily edge out the Americans, partly because of this folly of the Americans of trying to balance too many things, not keeping their allies with them, and partly because of a sense that America is not a reliable partner anymore.
Ambassador Hydari,
so I think
what kind of a relationship do you think the new Taliban regime is likely to have with China? Do you think that China will come in because the Taliban-run regime desperately needs financial aid? Beijing can provide financial aid. They will seek protection against any Uyghur extremists who may be in Afghanistan. The Taliban so far unwilling to provide that. How do you see the Taliban-Beijing equation emerge over the next several weeks?
We've seen signs of engagement by both sides. The Taliban reaching out and visiting China even before they took over, Kabul, and then Chinese reaching out at the different levels. I think Deputy Director of the Doha office recently also spoke with the Deputy Foreign Minister of China, discussing the importance of friendly relations and Chinese promising humanitarian assistance, and the Taliban welcoming that. I think they promised increased COVID-19 support, but nothing else. And of course, the Chinese know that the Taliban are sheltering ETIM, Eastern Pakistan Islamic movement, right across from Xinjiang province in the northeast of Afghanistan, where ETIM and IMU actually fought alongside the Taliban to capture much of northeast of Afghanistan. So the Taliban will be using that leverage, and as well as their state sponsor, to keep the Chinese engaged with that promise of cooperation and collaboration, that somehow the Chinese interest would be served, both security and as well as longer-term economic interest in Afghanistan.
Okay, meanwhile, the intense battle between the Taliban and the resistance forces continues in Panjshir, which is the last free citadel in Afghanistan. Both groups are claiming to have inflicted massive casualties on the other. The gunfight is seeming to intensify. India Today is the only channel to be reporting from ground zero in Panjshir. Take a look at this world exclusive.
Battleground Panjshir. Intense firing between Taliban fighters and resistance. Taliban blocks all roads leading to Panjshir. Tanks, armored fighting vehicles and heavily armed Taliban fighters.
Fighting between the Taliban and the resistance force led by Ahmad Massoud on the Gulbahar area, the entrance to Panjshir, Afghanistan. Taliban has also blown up a bridge connecting the Gulbahar road with Panjshir in the Kalash.
This is Gulbahar, the entry point to Panjshir. Taliban have blown up an important bridge encircling Panjshir, choking the supply routes.
We will fight anyone who opposes the Islamic Emirate system.
The resistance fighters are undeterred. They have been brought up on tales of valor of the legendary Tajik commander Ahmad Shah Massoud and his resistance of both the Taliban and the Soviets. The young generation too wants to live up to the legends.
The war has started in Panjshir and the Taliban are being defeated, and we will fight till the last drop of blood in our body.
And the fighting in the past several days has been intense. There are reports of casualties on both sides. The resistance claims they have neutralized over 350 Taliban fighters, beating back multiple attacks.
Lots of casualties from Taliban side, around 15 wounded and a few have been captured.
Taliban deny having suffered fatalities, but locals say they have been used by Taliban to go to the front lines as human shield and also to retrieve bodies of fighters killed.
Taliban are forcing people out of their homes and are taking them to the war front.
The resistance commanders have also confirmed that the Taliban is using locals around Panjshir as human shields to retrieve bodies, but claim they have held fire to ensure locals do not lose their lives.
That they have entered the Shotul district of Panjshir province. This is absolutely lie. They have approached Shotul last night, but they have been pushed back and they have suffered lots of casualties. At least 40 of their dead were in the battlefield.
The Taliban have sought reinforcements to take on the resistance fighters at Panjshir, and the siege is expected to go on much longer.
Taliban have suffered heavy losses, but the area is under siege and transportation routes are all closed.
The fear is writ large on faces of people.
The ongoing war has affected the local population in Gulbahar at the entry point of Panjshir. They live in fear amidst warning food supplies.
Gulbahar market is running out of supplies and the streets are deserted.
Taliban attacks intense. People in Panjshir will face shortage of food and medicines. Roads should be reopened.
Food prices have doubled due to the conflict and people fear the worst is yet to come.
India Today and Ashdaq, the only channels on ground to report from battlefield Panjshir. The Taliban launched an attack at 11 p.m. on Tuesday night. You can hear the gunshot in the background. The office of style ongoing casualties expect both sides. Will Ahmad Masood and Amrullah Saleh be able to resist Taliban's all-out attack? We will report every detail from battlefield Panjshir. Ahmad Naveed Kavish reporting from Gulbahar, Panjshir.
We'll slip into a very quick break. We'll have more details on the other side. Stay with us. We're back in a moment.